Hello and welcome. My name is Rachel Davidson Humphreys, and you are at the Bill of Rights Institute Civic Conversations, a live podcast webinar looking at difficult conversations in the history classroom. We have a summer series going right now, which is race, religion, and politics, and I am so absolutely thrilled to be joined by my dear friend and collaborator, Dr. Anika Prather. Anika, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Prather and I have known each other a couple of years now. We both went to the same undergraduate at St. John's College, but Dr. Anika, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Rachel and I were just talking about how in the world did I get to this place? I'm shocked when I think about where I've come from. I'm a child of a pastor. I grew up going to predominantly Christian schools in the 70s and 80s and early 90s. Dealt with and experienced a lot of intense racism. Graduated from Christian schools. When I graduated, I said I'd never want to see another school like this again. So I ran into the arms of Howard University, and I went there for my BA in elementary education, and then went on to get graduate degrees in music ed, theater ed, and a graduate degree in liberal arts from St. John's College. And then I got my Ph.D. in curriculum and instruction, focusing on the relevancy of classical education in the Black community. And it's so interesting because I was supposed to be a world-renowned performer for children. I wanted to create, direct children's plays and musicals, and that was my dream. But somehow I ended up being drafted into teaching a great books program at a classical school that my parents started, even though I told them that they shouldn't start it. This was not for our people. And they, of course, are much more stubborn than I am. I guess that's how I got the way I am. And they started it anyway. And because I love them, I helped them by, as well, I'll just teach music and drama there. But then that just was like bait. Once I got in there and began to see the great books classes and began to read the texts, I eventually ended up being the great books teacher. And that's when I realized that this narrative, that classical study is irrelevant to us, was a false narrative. As I began to look at the common human themes, that's what drew me first. It wasn't because I knew Black people were connected to it. What drew me first was how Aristotle and Socrates and the Greek myths and the tragedies spoke to me. And then later, I discovered an entire Black classical tradition that was running parallel with the white classical tradition from beginning to end till now. And once I saw that, that just took my passion for it to a whole other level.
Well, thank you. Your journey is so powerful, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to bring you on to start this conversation. So we're here today. Welcome everyone online. There are quite a few of us. Feel free to use the chat. You can chat with us, the panelists, or you can chat to the panelists and attendees. So thank you for being here today. We're excited, whether you're with us on Zoom or on YouTube, to hear your comments and questions. So we brought Dr. Prather in to this series to talk about race in the history classroom. One of the things that BRI knows is that history teachers are struggling a lot with these conversations. Yes. And so Dr. Prather is a great friend of the Institute and of us, and we wanted to invite her to have this conversation with us. So as we're having the conversation, just let us know if you have any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll be sure to get to them. So first, you touched on this a little bit, Anika, but how did you go from a classroom teacher to now what I'm going to call one of the premier voices advocating classical education for Black liberation? What was that transition like?
I told you that's a book title. I've written it down. I'm still in shock that this is where I am. My parents started the classical school, and I saw amazing things happen with those students. It was a small school. I don't think it ever had more than 50 or 60 students, but students came out of there studying classically, just really having such a beautiful worldview, but still very proud of who they were as Black young people. And so seeing that, I decided when I started my PhD program at Maryland, I was going to do performing arts in the classroom. And then I was also teaching at the school. And then just one night, I just was thinking about the students I was working with in the Great Books class. And then one night I said, I got to change my research focus, which did not go over well in my department, especially by a couple of professors. And so to me, being here is a shock, because when I finished, it was such a hard struggle getting out. There were a lot of roadblocks. I thank goodness for Dr. Wiseman and Dr. Hultgren, who were just so supportive of my work, who helped me get out of there because they believed I had the right to research this interest. And so but when I finished graduating, I put the dissertation in a drawer. And the dissertation does a close look at the effect reading great books or the works of the canon have on Black students. How were they able to connect to them? What was it doing for them? And there were stories such as a Black male going into engineering, I was one of the few students who could read the engineering text and understand it because of how we had to read Aristotle. Just very practical things they noticed about their classical education and how it helped it to serve them outside of a classical school, just in the regular world. And so it was exciting to research this, but it was hard to get people to believe me or to want to hear this story. And not just white people. White people didn't want to hear it. White people didn't want to hear it. So for me to be here at this place is amazing. So the dissertation sat in a drawer for 3 years and no one knew. I went back, my parents' school closed. Several years later, I opened up another classical school with a little bit of a different twist to it, but that's a whole nother story, but definitely rooted in the classical tradition. And again, I began to see the same thing, just this response to reading classic literature. And so, but again, thinking only just my little community, just these little group of students that I'm working with will believe it. And then one day, St. John's, who will not leave me alone, asked me to speak. I love them so much because they've been so supportive of my work. And they asked me to speak. They knew what I had done my dissertation on, so they asked me to speak. And it just so happened that, especially I think somehow Jeremy Tate got wind of me. And if you know Jeremy Tate, if anyone's out there listening, he's not one to just keep things quiet. And so he began to just say, hey, I gotta get you on Twitter. Like, I want to tell everyone, can you write a blog post for the classical learning test? He's the founder of the classical learning test. And that's really where it started. Somebody giving me the platform to share my research, to share what I had been discovering. And what I found is that there were others in the world who were seeing what I was seeing as they worked with all types of students, Black, white, immigrant, seeing the same effect. And then when I began to talk about how I felt classical studies, especially because of the Black classical tradition, could be used to connect us all, then that's a part of my dissertation too. It's at the end, what I hope. There's a chapter where I have to talk about what is my hope with my research. And it is that we use it to bring racial healing. That was one of the things I say at the end of the dissertation. So I talk a lot about that. And the reason why I feel the classes can be racial healing is you don't have to like it, whether you like it or not. We all read them. Your ancestors read them. My parents have even said, yeah, we read that. And so this is like literally like the only thing we have in common. If we don't understand anything else, most of us have some connection to Shakespeare, some connection to the myths, the Greek myths and things like that. And it can kind of maybe create some type of common space for conversation, for healing, a buffer as we have difficult conversations. And so as I share that, it seems like it's touching a nerve that I did not expect. There was a lot of insecurity in me because of what I went through in my doctorate program. So it's been exciting to see people say, I want to hear what you're saying. I want to hear this.
I love your persistence through that adversity. I mean, you and I have talked quite a bit about the challenges that you had even getting your dissertation into committee, and then the challenges with the committee,
Yes.
because there is this narrative and you have this alternate view.
Yes.
So most of our audience is actually history teachers. And
okay.
so it's going to be like, and you in the chat, if you want to kind of mention what you teach or where you teach, we'd love to kind of see where you're coming from. but BRI focuses on primary source use in the history classroom. And so that's why we wanted to bring you in, because you mentioned that especially when it comes to racial conversations, primary source use can act as a kind of buffer.
Yes.
Why have you focused on this kind of class? Can you expand on that a little bit? How does the primary source act as a catalyst or buffer for conversations around race?
When we depend on what, say, the news or the media says, or the meme your girlfriend put up for our understanding, you get sometimes a real twisted version of what the author intended. So, but what I learned at St. John's is by reading the ancient text. Charlotte Mason calls the canon or the great books, she calls them living books. I love that term. I love that term because I use those interchangeably, because basically what she's saying is the author is living through his text, his or her text. And so you get to the truth. And what I found is in the original or the primary source is the person is just telling their true experience. It's rooted in a lot more fact as opposed to just what somebody wants to twist it to be. It's a firsthand account of this or that. And so when you have this rule of, can we get back to the text, it really strips away your biases. It strips away your sometimes cloudy worldview, because all you can do is look at what is this person saying. A real practical example was I was engaged in a discussion about CRT, and a person shared with me a video or something or article written by someone critiquing CRT. And I kept saying, can you give me an original source? Can you give me a primary source? And that's very helpful. And there was no argument, there was no bitterness there, but just pulling us back to what this person said. And did he really say these things that we're hearing out there in the mainstream? And then if we go back to that original thought from that author, what can it teach us? What can we learn about ourselves from it? And it kind of takes us away from ourselves, if that makes any sense. And then you can't argue with the truth. Like, you can't argue with the original source, because this is what it is, what he said, what he or she has said.
Right. And actually, so we have a bunch of questions that we prepared for this, but you brought up CRT and we talked about it in our prep call, and Christina Allen actually already asked a question about this. And we can just go there and then we'll get back to our list if you're okay with that.
Yeah, totally.
So she says, I'm really wondering how we will address these issues, meaning issues of race in the classroom, meaningfully now that critical race theory is under so much fire. Right. I just don't know where to begin if I can't discuss how understanding the differences in the treatment of people in our country isn't at the basis of the conversation. She would really like to hear your thoughts. So yes. I hear her saying, you know, how can we have these conversations meaningfully? What advice, what suggestions do you have, especially in light of this controversy about critical race theory?
Right. Someone is responding, that they're astounded that so many states are creating legislation against CRT. And a lot of the, let's just say this first of all, and this statement doesn't mean that I agree or disagree with anything, but I just want to make a statement. A lot of the pushback we're hearing about it is because I have yet to meet very many people who have read the works of Derek Bell, and I think, is it Richard Delgado? And there's a woman, I can't remember her name, I'm so sorry. If it comes to me, I'll say her name as well. Derek Bell comes to my mind even more. But, and I got a book, I wish I could show you the picture, but it's called—
Our audience is letting us know it's Kimberly Crenshaw.
Kimberly Crenshaw, thank you. I'm so sorry, but I hate to leave out the sister, but yeah, so, and they just have really they all have written very interesting pieces about, you know, real life experience living as a Black person or a person of color, a marginalized person in America. So when we say things like, well, I disagree with that, that means you're saying you're disagreeing with an actual real life experience someone has had or is having. It's kind of like if we make it even more practical, and I hope I'm getting to the point that you're looking for, but if we make it a real life example, I'm a Black woman. I have my brother, I have one sibling, right? Black male, beautiful chocolate brother, about almost 6 feet tall, about 5'10" or whatever. Since the day he got a driver's license, he's been stopped by police. I mean, it was just such a regular occurrence. It was so frustrating. Every time he took a girl out on a date, he'd come home angry. Dad, they stopped me again. Dad, they accused me of not paying at the restaurant. Dad, it was just, he was constantly, all the way up until he got married, had children, had become a pastor. And he was stopped by police. And the policeman says to him, and he's in his 40s at this point, with children, and he's a pastor. And the policeman says, where are the drugs? Where are the guns? And he's just leaving. And at the time, he was a pastor and a podiatrist. He was leaving his practice on his way home from work. And he passes a police car. And this has been his life, his whole life. So when he passed the police car, he said, he's going to stop me. And it's exactly what the policeman did. And my brother was so frustrated. He had his hands on the steering wheel like my dad had taught him, but he just simply started talking with his hands. And the man was so mean and said, you better put your hands on the wheel. Like, there are people, whether you want to believe it or not, I know we love police. We have friends and family who are police officers. This should not be his experience or anyone's experience, right? So when someone writes theoretically, politically, a real well thought out academic intellectual addressing of this concern, and people say, I don't agree with that, that's really difficult. So I'm sharing that personal story, and I've been stopped by police for driving through a neighborhood late at night. There are these towns called the sundown towns or sunset towns where after a certain time, police look for Black people driving through these neighborhoods. And if you're caught, you get stopped. And I was in one of those, and I got slapped with a $300 ticket. So my point is this. I'm sharing those real life stories with you that I think one of the things we have to do as teachers, and it's a very simple process, is first, believe our students. Believe what their narratives may be, what their perceptions may be, what their worldviews, their experience. Like, if we could just do that, that's not even scientific, that's not even academic, that's just empathy. Like, can we start there? Because I think a lot of energy is spent, because what is that? A lot of energy is spent trying to hold up another narrative. Why? Because we want to trust police. And we should, but we don't want to see it that police really are. Because a lot of times young people will share these stories and they say, well, that happens to everybody. And you'll hear a teacher say that to another student. Most of my male students have been stopped by police, some held at gunpoint on the ground. And so this is very real. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is trying to create a balance between believing the narrative that Black people or people of color have gone through, but at the same time being sensitive to how do your white students feel in these turbulent times. Like, teachers are really called to be a place of empathy and balance, that you're not trying to address and make your students of color feel seen, but you're also making sure that just a spirit of grace and empathy is permeating the entire classroom, so that what you're doing is you are cultivating a space of safety, of healing, of freedom, and that you are the leader in helping your students engage in civil discourse about these things. Civil discourse. Like, you don't want, like, I remember I had a teacher, I'm gonna say this one thing as another, because this was my history teacher. I was in high school at the time, and this student says, why do your people get to have a national anthem? And he was very mean. This was me in high school. I guess I was about a senior. And she didn't really help to cultivate, like, that would have been her time to say, that's a great question, so-and-so. Let's look at why Black people have a Black national anthem. Because there are a lot of people who think we just don't want to be a part of America. There are literally people that feel that's why we have a Black national anthem. They don't know the story of James Weldon Johnson. He was a man of God. He created this song to help us have hope in times of Jim Crow, of oppression. because we were not allowed to vote. We didn't have rights. We weren't seen and heard. So that song is just kind of a way to remember how far we've come. And that in these times where America is still evolving, we can return back to that song for a sense of hope and a way to feel like we're a part of this country. I hope that was not too long, and I hope you
not at all. That was like, you know how I feel, but anything, every direction we go is a good direction when it's the two of us. So I think, and from the chat, it sounds like this is really touching a chord. This idea of believe your students.
Yes.
Understand that they have their own experiences that are all valid and valuable.
Yes.
And this is, again, I want to tie it back to the primary source work, because I think that's fundamentally what a primary source, what a good text can do.
Yes.
A good text can help your students build empathy with another.
Yes.
In a way that allows them to then build empathy with another that they know.
Yes. Yes. And
so, and I love that Christopher Carlisle says our students are primary sources for today's history. I love that.
Good. I love that.
That's
a tweet. That's a tweet. I need to write that down. Yes, leave that in the chat.
And I think that all primary sources were the lived experiences of those who wrote them.
Yes.
And that allows us to have empathy across time.
Yes.
And by helping our students practice that empathy across time with the primary sources, we then bring them into empathy with one another by having them empathize across about a common idea.
Right.
And so, Mark, someone asked if we're familiar with the Touchstones discussion project.
Yes.
Both of us are very familiar.
Yes, I use them at my school. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so just kind of staying on this thread, your focus, so BRI at the Bill of Rights Institute, we focus on primary source use in the history of the classroom.
Yes.
You focused particularly both your research and your writing and your speaking on classical texts and the Black experience.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit? Because I think most of our audience has no idea about this history.
Yes.
Can you give us a brief overview of the connection between classical text and the Black experience?
Yes. Let me say a quote, or try to remember a quote by Anna Julia Cooper. Now, Anna Julia Cooper was a slave, an enslaved woman, and she came out of that, became a classics scholar, and she makes this statement. She says, "I know," something along the lines of, I know you may not make sense to you, but I cannot help but see so much hope for my country. Now, I'm starting off with that quote because the reason I look at the Black classical tradition is not why some people in the past who were Black who read classics. And this is why classics gets a bad rap in the Black community. There have been a number of Black people who read classics to be elitist. They wanted to separate themselves from their own people. They wanted to assimilate more. I'm not a fan of assimilation, but I do believe in unity, and I do believe in integrating, becoming a part of something, right? But still holding on to your individuality. Okay, and so what I found, the pattern so I don't focus a lot on Black classic scholars. So William Scarborough is not in my research, even though he's one of the first Black classicists, and I really love him. But I look really closely at Black activists rooted in classics. Civil servants, Black civil servants rooted in classics, who were very instrumental in working in policy, somehow changing the policies of our nation, just how they broke barriers and uplifted the race within the country. And so that's really important, that perspective, because the Black classical tradition is very broad. Classical study is just so pervasive in Black history. And that's something we don't understand, and we all need to understand. It's not a small group of elitist people. It's not a talented 10th, as Du Bois would say. Everybody and they mama, as somebody would say. We're reading classics. Everybody, even the person who didn't go to school. Frederick Douglass would be an example of that, right? Abraham Lincoln didn't even have a formal education past a certain grade level, right? But he understood classics. It was just what was done. And so the enslaved people picked that up. Literally, I mean, I have evidence from 1776 showing that. Now, why is that important to understand? Because we are divided. Now, some people say, we've never been so divided before, ever. Jim Crow, my friends. Yeah, we've been divided. But in this Black classical tradition, I am seeing this hard work, this effort to first study classics to get a sense of their common humanity, to understand the foundations of America. And then they took that knowledge to do the work of making us one, of creating what Martin Luther King would call the beloved community. And it wasn't done to be elitist. It wasn't done to say I'm better than. It wasn't done to forget your heritage. It was done to do the work of making our country a more perfect union. What does that tell us as history teachers? We are picking up the mantle there. When we are reading these primary sources, when we're reading from the old texts, we are continuing the work that Abraham Lincoln tried to start with Reconstruction. We're continuing the work of Martin Luther King. We're continuing the work of Oliver Howard, founder of Howard University, who set up classical schools for Black people all over the United States. And what is that work? We're sharing this common core knowledge of the canon with all of our students, with the effort of cultivating a spirit and a heart of unity, not unity that's rooted in colorblindness, not unity rooted in everyone just accepting one narrative, but unity rooted in, I see you and I see you. And I want to hear your story, and your story matters. And all of our stories woven together make up the beautiful tapestry of America. Like, have you ever seen a tapestry where everything was the same color? That's not as beautiful as one where all the different colors of the rainbow are interwoven. So when children, whether they're immigrant, Black, white, no matter who they are, when they're given a safe space to share their narrative, to understand each other's narrative within the context of the canon, then we help to sew together that tapestry. And that is really our job as teachers. And that's why the primary sources, how they help us do that.
And I know that you also are a fiber artist, so that weaving and that interweaving is very much part of the fabric of what you do.
Yes.
For those of you that don't know, Anika is a wonderful weaver and knitter, and
my
she
stress
has all
reliever.
these. Her stress reliever is also this beautiful created tapestry because she's just so cool. So we have a couple of questions going in the chat. There are actually quite a few threads. We have, over 100 people listening live right now. So one of the big themes is how do we take these discussions of slavery and racism in all white classes, or in classes where there's just very limited representation. You've now been a part of a lot of classical conversations within the classical community where you've been the only Black woman in the room, the only person of color in the room.
Yes.
So you have a lot of personal experience with what the best way to engage those conversations. And again, we're not asking you to speak for all people, but just from your own teaching experience and your own experience in those conversations, what advice do you give for teachers?
I think also one bit of advice, and this is going back to the importance of classics, why they help us in our perspective. Let me do another quote that I hope I can remember off the top of my head from James Baldwin. He says something along the lines of, when he began to study other human civilizations, he began to see that his story was not the only one. It wasn't so different from the stories of those in the past. When we read, I really feel a lot of people who are resisting CRT and the studying of, and filling in the holes of history is they may not be reading about human civilizations. And I said this a while ago, I can't remember where I was speaking, but I was talking about if you just step back for a minute and look at human history from the beginning of time, there has been this ebb and flow of a rise and fall of a different human civilization. Everybody's had their chance. Started with Africa. Africa was the first world power. You can, if you want to look that up, be my guest. Africa was the first world power. Then you have to been into Middle Eastern civilizations, became the next set of world powers, and then Greece, then Rome, and so on, right? And we've all had this. And there's always been this pattern of when these human civilizations come, they set up laws, they set up governments, they set up systems that work in favor of whoever is in charge at the time. Now, we can't deny the fact that there was enslavement. We can't deny the fact that America was founded by people from the West. That's just is, and that's never going to change, no matter how much we may want it to. It just is. And so we can't deny what that means, that these people in power saw only themselves as the most important thing. And these systems and things were set up to connect with that. Now, that's not something but the beautiful thing about America that makes us so different than any other human civilization is that all the other human civilizations, to make that stop, had to be overthrown. America, because of that beautiful Constitution, please, teaching your kids the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, all of those, don't just let them believe it's all racist. Those documents, those were the same documents Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, and all of those who fought in front of Congress for us used to win for us, right? So this document called the Constitution sets us apart from all other human civilizations, where our people, all citizens, no matter what color you are, no matter what orientation you are, no matter what you believe, no matter who you are, you can say, hold up, all men are created equal. It's in the word. It's in the word right here. And so you can incite a level of respect in all of your students that, wait a minute, we live in a country that all these hundreds of years that we've been in existence and all this turmoil we've had, I'm getting emotional when I just think about it. We've never been overthrown. There hasn't been an uprising where somebody actually successfully overthrew America and came over and took control. Why? Because we are a nation for the people, by the people, right? And so, and because of the powerful, that thing is so tight, right? I see you, Catherine Barker. I'm sorry.
Almost. I mean, January 6th was a difficult time. And again, January 6th in response to, all the other riots that have been happening, there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of tension. But watch this.
I sat there and watched that thing. My husband says I always see the positive side. I never see the dark side of anything. Instead of saying, oh, it's raining, I'm like, oh, it's raining, my flowers are going to get some water. Like, that's how I look at stuff. But January 6th, let me tell you what it did for me when I saw it. I saw, but because of the way the documents of our country function, Democrats and Republicans said, no, this is not how this is going to go down. So we were not overthrown. I saw the power of the documents even stronger that day. I know we're focusing so much on that mess, but at the same time, I see the power of our country, the documents that allowed even those who may have wanted another candidate or whatever, stood firm on the document. And so when we look at America, when we study classically and we read about all the different civilizations in the past and how they were defeated by another civilization and how America, all these hundreds of years, has continued to stand because the people can put their faith in this document. We're not there yet. We're not perfect yet. But when we look at it in comparison to other civilizations, I'm pretty proud of us. Even though I'm frustrated with the country sometimes, I can still be proud of us, So that's how classical and reading the canon and reading the old text and seeing us in light of all other human civilization helps us have a healthier perspective.
Absolutely. And I think that actually ties into by a question from Gretchen in the chat. She says, and you've thought a lot about this, like there's so much to read. There's so much context to give our students. We only have them for 180 days a year. Given so her question is, what would you say to schools that in their concern of making students of color feel seen and heard, and with making all students feel that texts are relevant, have prioritized assigning contemporary texts and texts that are contemporary texts and texts by and about contemporary Black, Indigenous, and people of color young people in particular over older texts, especially over classics.
Right.
Given limited time in the year, how would you personally go about putting together a reading list for high school or middle school literature class? Before you answer, I'm going to plug, if you go to Dr. Prather's website, she has quite a few reading lists. So if you
it's always growing. Yeah.
If you Google Anika Prather, she has a bunch of reading lists for each grade level, I think middle and high school.
drprather.com. drprather.com.
But I think that this is again, part of your research is it's not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not about adding more or different, but seeing what's there.
Yes.
What's in the texts already. And there was a question earlier on about the kind of whiteness of the classical community and how that can, how the classical community can be more inviting to the Black experience, or to the people of the experience of people of color. Right. So can you tell, I know the story, but I want to hear it from you. Can you tell us a little bit about what the work is to see the Black the Black experience in the classics? Tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. First, let me cite Frank Snowden is my main source for this, and he wrote a book. This is also on my list. If you go to Teacher's Toolbox, that's one place where I have a long list of links and all that stuff for what I do, the work that I have, hopefully to support what you're doing in the classroom. But Frank Snowden wrote a book called Blacks in Antiquity, and he wrote another book called Before Color Prejudice. And what he does is he goes through all of the texts of ancient Greece and Rome, proving the ancient African presence there. But in doing that, I also found Middle Eastern, like Cyrus the Great from the Middle East. And what I'm trying to encourage teachers to do too is when you're reading a classic text, like the Ethiopians are mentioned in the Odyssey, for example. Like, when I share these kinds of things with other scholars, they'll say to me, I have been studying classics all these years and I never saw that. And that's because, sadly, the way education is done, it's not created to see the other. And we just have to be real about that. I'm not bitter. We can't be mad about that. But we all have been educated. I'm almost 50 years old. I never learned about any Black history in my schooling. None. And so, and some people say, well, I did. Okay, well, I'm glad. That's wonderful. But for the most part, America has really struggled with either no reference to the other or very segregated references. You can take it as elective. You can do it at Black History Month. The problem with that is if you don't show where the Black people are in ancient Greece and Rome, because they're saying it, the writers are not hiding it. They're talking about Cush. They're talking about the Ethiopians, which I think are the same, but they're talking about the Egyptians. I'm sorry. They're saying their names. They're describing them as beautiful and fierce and powerful, right? And then as you move up, I talked to someone this week who didn't realize St. Augustine was from Africa. So we have that, and you just kind of, but he says it says the name, like even if you're a Christian teacher here in the Bible, I still can't find a Christian publisher that will show people of color in the Bible when there's so many different ethnic groups intersecting in the ancient times in the Holy Scriptures, right? And so as a teacher, we see it and we just make sure we point that out, use the map, show the kids, hey, this person was from Africa, so that we can kind of cancel out that narrative that these things are all white. Now, as you move up, as we get more and more into the time periods of colonization and all of that, the texts become more and more, less and less diverse. The early texts are very diverse. You can see them intersecting there. So what do we do about that? This is why I love the Black classical tradition. Because if you're reading Henry David Thoreau, you need to be reading a lot of the Black abolitionists because he was connecting with that work. Okay. And so as you are working through the text beyond the medieval period, it's going to take some research, which is what I think my Teacher's Toolbox will help you with on my website, to find, like, even if you don't get a whole new curriculum, but you're sticking with your curriculum, it's very simple. I told a teacher the other day, like, just put a search. If you're in a certain place in history, put Black people in, like the other day, I said, any Black people with Columbus. I did a search yesterday, Black people with Columbus. I found it was a Black explorer. I forgot his name, but it means his name was something the Moor. He was a Black man. He was with Columbus. I found out that there was a Black man with Lewis and Clark. I know his name. His name was York. And so all you have to do is, if you have your history book, we're there. People of color are always there. Yes, thank you. Pedro Alcinino. Thank you, Reginald. And so my point with that is this. As you're teaching your curriculum, put in questions. Was there anybody from Spain? Was there anybody, were any Black people, Africans? And then you can, as you're teaching, you can begin to highlight, this story is not just about white people. And white students need to understand this. This story is not just about them and how their ancestors started America, because literally everyone started America. One final example, I'm sorry, Rachel, like if you're talking about, if you're talking about Thanksgiving, if you're talking about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, if you're talking about the Constitution, you got to talk about the Iroquois Nation. You've got to talk about the Constitution of the Iroquois Nation, because our Constitution is modeled after that. And Ben Franklin doesn't hide that. He invites them to the convention, right? So my point is, as you're teaching, you're not trying to make it all Black. You're not trying to make it all Native American. I mean, if you just step back, if we all for a minute could just step out of the fight and look back for a minute. Do you see how many people fought for this country, fought for this narrative? It wasn't just white people. I just finished reading, and the last example, Never Caught. It's the book about George Washington's slave that was never caught. She ran away to freedom. And the way the historian talks about how George Washington's slaves, enslaved people, were very much a part of what he did. They were there helping him get dressed. They were driving him to the meetings. They were protecting him. They were doing all this. And yes, but their story is important, because what you want to cast the vision for in your classrooms is that this is our story. And these texts, these primary sources, drive that point home. The danger of only going straight to contemporary sources is a lot of those who write that aren't revealing that truth about us. I'm not saying you shouldn't do contemporary texts, but I try to, because I'm trying to raise up a generation of young people that understand this is our story. We are a part of this narrative. We served a very important role in this narrative. And sometimes people miss that. Sometimes the story is the typical stereotypical story about Black people that people stick with: crime, single motherhood, and not to say those things aren't real narratives, but that's not all who we are. If your only history lesson about Black people is us as slaves, you're totally missing Benjamin Banneker, who helped design the layout of DC. So we don't want to just tell the slave narrative. We want to tell the narrative of what we did to make this country a more perfect union. And so when we go back to the original text, we capture that narrative better, and then we move up. And that helps us determine what we read. And then even when they read contemporary texts, they'll read them in the light of understanding the true narrative of what it means to be a person of color in America.
And then through that reading, they have access to the community, right? So yes. Often, I mean, we could talk about this. I don't think that I don't know where the time goes, but we only have about 15 minutes left. I don't even know how that happened.
Oh my gosh, we could talk forever, girl.
But one of the things that you've talked about often is the kind of idea that the classics or these ideas are not for Black children, right? That they are somehow not able or not interested. It's not relevant to them. Yes. These great ideas that have formed a lot of our ideas about the nature of freedom in society just somehow aren't accessible to Black children for whatever reason.
Yes.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. And as somebody just mentioned, Phyllis Wheatley, I want to use her as a starting point. She was kidnapped from Senegal, I believe, at like 10, brought to Boston, bought by a man by the name of John Wheatley, and they educated her classically. Now, if this young girl, snatched from her homeland, her parents and everything she knew, was able to find liberation through reading these texts, if she was able to see them as relevant to herself, then there must be something to that right? And so Phyllis Wheatley she is actually our first example of showing the beginnings of the Black classical tradition in America, because there's a letter written by George Washington to her. I wish I could read it to you. George Washington wrote her a letter. She wrote him a poem. So, and he writes her back, thanking her for the letter and saying she's been gifted by the muses. And then he signs it, your faithful servant, George Washington. That it was dated February 1776. When was our country founded? 1776. She's the first Black person published in America. Now, some people struggle with Phyllis Wheatley, and I'm going to put this disclaimer in because her poems don't talk militantly enough. But there's a, and I have this book listed on my toolbox page. E. Ashley Harrison does a chapter on Phyllis Wheatley, and he says he feels that her writings were a Trojan horse. And if you study her poetry closely, you'll see her reference her frustration with slavery, but she hides it within the context of classics. And so she uses classics, the words of classics, as a form of a weapon and a form of resistance. And she goes on to be freed and this becomes the first Black woman published. She doesn't end well. Her life ends destitute. It was very hard for a Black woman to be successful. There was not a lot of support. Once her owners died, she did not have the support to continue her success. And so, but she is a part of the narrative, right? And so when we talk about her story and how she was able to be drawn to it as a Black woman, that's really important. And the same thing, Anna Julia Cooper's story, she came to the classics at 10 years old as well. And then Martin Luther King, a very gifted, he went to college at 15 years old, again, rooted in the classics. And so why are these examples of young people connecting to the classics in the Black community a revelation of how they can be relevant to us? Because each of these people I'm referencing, there's another gentleman, George Moses Horton. Now, he was a lot more vocal about his views on slavery. He used his literacy to do that. What I'm saying is that we should analyze how did they use the canon to serve their efforts in liberation. All of them did it differently. Now, for a long time, I wasn't a fan of Phyllis Wheatley, okay? But when I look at people like Huey P. Newton, who was a teenager when he first read Plato's Republic, and he goes on to start the Black Panther, what is it? Why did Toussaint, who incited that rebellion in Haiti, why was he reading classics? Why was Marcus Garvey reading classics? How did Frederick Douglass read classics and desire to fight for abolition? What is it about them? It's something about them that frees the mind. When we live in a society where we do feel oppressed, where we do feel the system is not working in our best interests. Our ancestors, my ancestors, they found another world. Du Bois says he was kind of enters this magical world where there's no scorn nor condescension. And he develops this understanding, this broader worldview. James Baldwin felt the same way. They tie in classics as a part of that journey to fighting for liberation, not elitism. And so when you show that to students, that process, like when you read their stories and you show them how this literacy help them create this understanding to fight for that, I feel like it could be an inspiration to our students as well. I see so many chats and I want to respond to all these.
I know, and we only have so much time, but we can continue the conversation. Yes. Dr. Prather's very, very active on Twitter, so you can go find her there and continue the conversation. But as our last kind of part of the conversation, I want to address, Tracy has brought this up in the chat a couple of times, but other people have brought it up as well. We've already discussed this idea of infusing of two things, so kind of synthesizing what we've talked about, that making sure that the Black voice is represented where it already is something that's a very easy ask when it comes to the history classroom. When we're examining texts, when we're examining periods, we just recognize and highlight the experience that already is in what we're doing.
Yes.
The other thing I hear you suggesting is that we, in addition, seek out the parallel
Yes.
voices that were at the same time intentionally.
Yes. Yes.
The thing we haven't touched on yet, which is, and this is what Tracy touches on, and someone else asked about it earlier, is what to do. So Tracy's question is, we attempt to teach the truth in our public school, but when the conversations get more political, she's afraid. She's a 45-year-old white woman, and she's really afraid that she's going to offend someone by even trying to have these conversations.
Yes.
And she's asking for suggestions, like how in predominantly white environments, or as a non-Black educator, what are your suggestions for how to have these conversations in ways that our administration or our parents are comfortable with?
Right. And I want to also make sure people understand that this conversation is about people who are teaching K-12. I have a very different perspective when it comes to working with young people as we discuss race. It's a lot gentler, and maybe some people may not always agree with that, but just from my experience, the teaching of race is very complex. It is very difficult because it's very painful. What Black people have gone through, what my ancestors have gone through is horrible. But I've had to make a choice between, am I a teacher or an activist? And I'm a teacher, and I'm a lover of children. And so I'm always thinking about, how can I do this to make this something that all teachers can wrap their mind around, so that across the world or nation, they can practice this in their classroom? What makes this easier for them to practice? And from that those baby steps, you get more courage to go farther. So with that being said, I think whenever you start a discussion, I want to encourage you to sit down with your class and develop some ground rules. One of the main things that St. John's has done, Touchstones does, even Junior Great Books does, if anybody's heard of them, is they have a class that's just about the rules of engaging in discussion. I think when you have them loosely, it opens up some dangers, some troubles there. And then have the students contribute to what these ground rules should be. We're gonna have. You may even want to call it something, that in this space and time, we're having these complex conversations. And as a group, what are the rules? So every Friday is when we're gonna have these complex discussions, whatever you want to call that moment, right? And you and the students set the ground rules for how you'll engage, so that everyone can be free to share what they feel, and it's safe, and you can't get angry, you can't get highly offended, because people have to be able to ask questions. They have to be able to voice what they feel. So that's the first thing I would encourage you to do, to make it a space. Don't do it loosely, The second thing is spend a lot of time listening. Like, a lot of times teachers want to do all of the discussing, which is really all of the talking. And it turns into a teacher monologue about what you think. But there's so much that can happen from just allowing the students to ask the questions and the students to respond to their thoughts, and you facilitating that process. And then see yourself as you're facilitating that, but you're also an equal participant. It's okay to come to these discussions humbly. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to understand everything, and be willing to be wrong. Be willing to learn from something one of your students says that corrects your thinking. And then tell them, thank you, Johnny. Like, I never saw it like that. You really taught me something there. This engagement in discussion and civil discourse is a humbling process. It's not something that we should come to thinking that we're the master of all knowledge. And with children, and when I say children, I mean the 18-year-olds too. With young people, their hearts are still fragile, their minds are still fragile, and anything we do can shape their perspective. So it's really important to handle that gingerly, and to patiently and slowly walk through that process, allowing the students to express themselves, to lead that discussion, and that you all have set ground rules together. And then finally, lean onto those primary texts. lean on them. When people get way off, I love this about St. John's, which was very helpful to me. When people want to get way off in left field someplace or on a rant, a gentle, okay, that's interesting, Susan. Can you show me how that thought connects to the text? It usually kind of helps bring it back to where you're trying to go. And then also these discussions, if they're rooted in a text, whether it be the Declaration of Independence or something from a Greek myth or something from I'm trying to think of some Martin Luther King or anybody else, any of the texts you may read, if you keep it rooted there, it helps keep it from going off the rails as well.
I think that's a great place to kind of land with this conversation. Just having the texts be that, and we started the conversation here. Yes. Having the text be the anchor for the conversation takes the pressure off. Somebody in the chat was mentioning Socratic seminars are good for both middle and high school. I'm going to give a plug for the Bill of Rights Institute. So Anika, one of the reasons Anika's on the journey with us that she is that we very early on invited her to help us design our Socratic workshops that we run and our Socratic badging that we offer. So BRI offers professional development in Socratic seminars. You can go to our website, type in Socratic badges. We are both products of St. John's College, and so we are very interested in helping you to have these kinds of difficult conversations. So join our workshops and our badges. We would love to have you there. Anika, this could go on for hours and hours, and you and I have such I have such admiration for the work that you do and for your scholarship and for your energy and for your enthusiasm. The panelists, the attendees have loved everything you've said. Is there anything we didn't touch on, or any kind of last thoughts that you want to leave our audience with?
I just want to reiterate again, using those resources at the Bill of Rights Institute, the curriculum I love for actually having these types of discussions is touchstones as well. I like them for, like, you know how I talked about having a moment where you have types of discussions that could lead to other things. The touchstones curriculum, even though it's talking about various different classics or the works of the canon, there's small excerpts and it helps the students practice. It gives you something to practice it with, as opposed to you looking for a curriculum. And it's an anthology of short excerpts from various works of the canon too. So that, in conjunction with the Bill of Rights and anything they put out, should equip you for practicing this in your classrooms. I hope everyone feels equipped. I hope everything I shared gave you ways to be equipped to do this in a healthy way.
Absolutely. And if you'd like to share this conversation in the future, we are putting it up on our YouTube channel, so you can head over there. Dr. Anika Prather, thank you so much for joining us this evening. This was a necessary conversation, and your advocacy and passion for all the communities you're a part of is so clear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.